It seems like you just can't avoid it these days. Everywhere you turn, more and more people are kind of stepping away from traditional religion, like questioning those big, long-held beliefs about a higher power.
Yeah, it's definitely a huge shift. And, with a history that's, well, as complicated and kind of twisted as belief itself, I guess.
And that's exactly what we're going to dig into for you today. We're taking a deep dive into this text called Introduction to Atheism and the reasons that led to its spread in the modern era.
Right.
It was written by Mohammed Saeed Raslan and translated by Omar bin Ahmed Tohami.
Okay.
And yeah, it's definitely a very specific take. But we want to walk you through this one particular understanding of this global trend.
Sure.
So our mission for you today is to pull out those key historical, philosophical, all the social arguments this text makes to explain this whole rise of atheism.
Right.
Hopefully to give you a clearer picture of this perspective on, well, a pretty complex phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's get right into it. What does this text say is the absolute core definition of atheism?
Well, the text is pretty straightforward right from the start. It defines atheism as this philosophical stance, right? And it says it's rooted in what it calls a nihilistic idea.
Okay.
Basically, it boils down to the denial of the existence of Allah as the creator.
Right.
The text really emphasizes the belief that the universe, well, it just originated without any divine creator at all. And a really key point here is that matter itself is eternal. It always existed, and it's its own source, like its own beginning and end.
Okay, so at its heart, we're talking about a denial of a creator, right?
Yeah.
And this idea that matter is just eternal.
Exactly. That's the foundation.
Pretty fundamental stuff.
Yeah.
But then the text throws in this kind of curveball. It mentions a second, maybe a less common understanding of atheism that's linked to Plato. What's that all about? It sounds like a different flavor of non-belief.
Yeah, this is where things get interesting. The text actually attributes this second definition to Plato, which is kind of wild. It suggests there's a creator, but this creator, well, they set the universe in motion and they're just completely detached from it.
So, they just kind of walked away?
Basically, abandoned any further control or involvement, just dedicated to their own ideal life, as the text puts it.
Wow.
It also connects the philosopher Apator to this idea, a kind of set it and forget it deity, I guess you could say.
Interesting.
It's definitely a lot more nuanced than just straight up denial. It really zeroes in on this idea of divine non-intervention.
That's a really fascinating twist, a creator who's basically gone AWOL. Now, the text, it doesn't beat around the bush when it comes to assigning blame for atheism's rise, right?
No, it doesn't.
It points a finger directly at a very specific historical institution. Who's in the hot seat, according to this source?
The text makes a very clear and direct argument. The European Church, it says, was the main force responsible for the initial emergence of atheism.
The church. That's a pretty bold claim. What's the logic behind that?
The text claims the church's own foolishness is what created this conflict between science and religion, a conflict that it sees as totally unnecessary. And it specifically criticizes the church for presenting these rigid, non-religious ideas as if they were the core of faith.
Right.
So, according to the text, this basically forced people to choose between what the church was presenting as divine truth, which often seemed, superstitious, and the emerging findings of science.
So as the text frames it, the church essentially forced people into this corner, making science seem like the only logical, rational path. Right?
Exactly. It emphasizes that the apparent cause, the scientific explanations of how things work, was misunderstood as somehow contradicting the question of why things exist in the first place.
Right.
The text argues that science wasn't inherently opposed to religion, but the church's rigid stance, well, it created this artificial opposition. And ultimately, led a lot of materialist scholars to abandon religious belief completely. They went for what seemed like a more evidence-based understanding of the world.
It seems like the text really sees the church's resistance to scientific progress as this turning point, almost like a self-inflicted wound.
Yeah, that's definitely the implication. The text suggests that embracing nature as an alternative to God in Europe was partly a reaction to, well, what was seen as the oppressive practices of the church, things like heavy taxes, the way religious authorities controlled people, and how they suppressed scientific inquiry.
Right.
But it's important to note that the text frames this initial wave of atheism as mostly limited to intellectual circles, scientists, philosophers, thinkers. The average person, they generally still held on to their religious beliefs, even if the text sees those beliefs as distorted.
Okay, so that's the initial spark as the text sees it. But then it gets into the development of like organized atheism.
No.
Who are the key figures, the architects of this more structured form of non-belief, according to this text?
Well, according to the text, the true founders of atheism, in its organized and widespread form, are the followers of, well, various secular ideologies.
Okay.
Things like communism, existentialism, Darwinism, and rationalism.
Right, so we're moving beyond just individual skepticism now.
Yeah.
We're talking about actual schools of thought, political movements.
Exactly. And here, the text gets into this pretty specific and pretty controversial claim.
Okay.
It alleges that the Zionist movement actually used these secular ideologies strategically as a way to spread atheism around the world. And the goal, according to the text, was to kind of break down the moral and legal foundations of nations by promoting atheism and, excessive materialism, which would then weaken their resistance and ultimately make way for Jewish world rule.
Wow, that's a huge and obviously very politically charged claim.
Yep.
And again, we want to be super clear that we're just presenting the arguments as they are in this text.
Absolutely, just laying it all out there.
Okay. So after that, the text names specific intellectual frameworks that it says fueled the spread of atheism. Things like Marx's economic theories and his materialist interpretation of history, Freud's ideas about psychology, Darwin's theory of evolution, and Durkheim's sociological theories.
Right.
The text says these frameworks kind of laid the groundwork for atheistic thought to go global. It also makes the point that the very first book to explicitly declare atheism appeared in Europe back in 1770.
That's right.
So let's shift gears now and talk about how this text describes atheism emerging in the Arab and Islamic world. What's the timeline and what are the key influences here?
According to the text, the first public articulations of atheism in the Arab and Islamic world, they started popping up after the mid-19th century.
Okay.
And the text links this to the increasing interaction with the West, particularly these educational missions and exchanges.
So it's suggesting that exposure to Western thought was a big catalyst.
That's the narrative it puts forward, yeah. Yeah. Initially, these students who went to study in the West, they came back really influenced by European materialism. And that led to, a greater focus on science and reason, and this push to separate religion from government.
Okay.
But the text does point out that, at least in this initial phase, there wasn't really a direct call for atheism. Instead, the focus was on things like national liberation, adopting aspects of Western progress, and reinterpreting religious texts in a more rational way.
So it was more about reform and modernization than outright atheism, at least at first.
Exactly. It wasn't about throwing out faith completely just yet.
That makes sense.
But the text argues that as these connections with the West deepened, explicit calls for atheism did start to emerge.
Okay.
And they often framed it in terms of individual freedom.
Right.
The text also singles out the alleged role of Jewish activity in Turkey, which he claims led to less religious observance and more hostility towards religious practices. And this, according to the text, culminated in Ataturk's secularization of Turkey and the spread of atheistic ideas, especially through books like Mustafa Kemal.
So according to the text, Egypt is another key place for the development and spread of atheism in the Arab world, right?
Yeah, definitely. It describes this period in Egypt as the age of literary and intellectual renaissance, though it frames this movement as fundamentally about Westernization.
Interesting.
It says that big thinkers and writers at the time, they were advocating for Western ideals and increasingly for atheism, often presenting it as, enlightenment or intellectual freedom.
Okay.
And it claims that Egypt, unfortunately, also picked up some of the bad stuff from European society in this process.
Right.
And that both Western Orientalists and some Egyptians actively worked to spread disbelief in atheism, trying to replace traditional Islamic values with, utilitarian and materialistic ones. This fever of apostasy and atheism, as the text calls it, then spread from Egypt to other Arab countries in the region.
Okay, so then the text gives us this list of people it considers famous atheists in both Europe and the Islamic world. Can you tell us about some of the key figures it highlights?
Sure. So in Europe, the text really focuses on Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the guys who came up with communism. It also includes those existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and Albert Camus. And while it doesn't say it directly, the text clearly implies that people who follow Darwinism are part of this group too.
Okay.
And then among philosophers and writers, it lists some big names like Friedrich Nietzsche, Bertrand Russell, Hegel, Herbert Spencer, and Voltaire. It's like a who's who of thinkers who, in different ways, challenge the traditional norms.
It definitely is a list of very influential and often controversial thinkers. Now, what about the figures, the text names from the Islamic world? Who are some of those key individuals?
Okay, so the text starts by mentioning Ismail Ahmed Adam, an Egyptian who was a big proponent of populism. He wrote a book called Why Is He an Atheist? Around 1926. It also talks about Ismail Mazhar, another Egyptian who supported populism and Darwinism. He published Al-Yusur magazine, which the text says promoted atheistic ideas and was critical of Arab society, although it does mention that he later returned to faith and wrote a book called Islam, not Communism.
Interesting.
There's also mention of the League of New Literature and its secretary, Kemal Kilani, who also supposedly renounced his earlier views.
Right.
And then there were poets who contributed to Al-Yusur and expressed atheistic or skeptical viewpoints, like Abdul Latif Thabet and the Iraqi poet Jamil Sidki al-Zahawi.
Okay.
And then there's Sadiq Jalal al-Azam, a big name in materialistic communist thought who wrote Critique of Religious Thought. And then there's Abdullah bin Ali al-Qasimi, a more contemporary writer who initially wrote about Islam but then became a vocal atheist with books like The Shackles. And the Kuwaiti poet Fahd bin Saleh bin Muhammad al-Askar, described as a skeptic of religion. And finally, a few Egyptian intellectuals and writers are included, like Ahmed Lotfi al-Said, Taha Hussein, Zaki Najib Mahmud, and the Syrian poet Ali Ahmed Saeed, who was known as Adonis. It's pretty fascinating to see the text drawing these connections across different fields and regions.
It certainly paints a picture of a pretty widespread intellectual movement. So after that list, the text goes on to outline what it sees as the fundamental ideas of atheism, right? Like the core beliefs and principles.
Right.
What are some of the key things it attributes to atheists?
Well, the text lays out several key tenets of atheism. Most basic one is the denial of Allah as the creator.
Right.
And then stemming from that is the second idea. The belief that the universe and all life forms just came about by pure chance and that there's no afterlife.
Okay.
The text emphasizes that this directly follows from rejecting the idea of a divine creator and a divine purpose for everything.
Makes sense.
Third, the text highlights the belief that matter is eternal and is basically the source of everything, like it's both the origin and the substance of everything.
Oh.
And fourth, it presents the view that any kind of religious worldview just inherently gets in the way of scientific progress. Fifth, it notes that atheists reject the idea of prophets performing miracles, because that would mean accepting divine intervention and revelation, which they don't believe in.
Right.
But then, interestingly, the text points out what it sees as a kind of contradiction in how atheists think.
Okay.
It says atheists accept these huge evolutionary leaps in Darwinism, even though from the text perspective, there isn't enough scientific evidence to support them.
Right.
You know, like the idea of apes evolving into humans.
Yeah.
So the text questions why atheists are willing to accept certain improbable things without sufficient evidence while rejecting others.
That's a really interesting point the text brings up. It's like, where do you draw the line on what requires evidence? So what other core ideas does the text attribute to atheism?
Well, it says atheists tend to see history as this kind of negative and ultimately meaningless series of events. It argues that atheists consider religious knowledge to be fundamentally different from and incompatible with rational and scientific knowledge.
Okay.
They say it just can't be subjected to the same kind of scrutiny.
Right.
The text also describes the atheist view of human beings as just material entities, governed by natural laws, with no real inherent superiority to other things in the material world.
Okay.
And finally, it mentions the materialist idea that our material needs are what drive the development of ideas rather than the other way around.
Interesting.
And the text ends this section by repeating its earlier claim that the core theories of atheism, Marxism, Freudianism, Darwinism, and Durkheimian sociology, they've all been scientifically debunked.
Okay.
It says they're just based on intuition, imagination, and personal biases.
So the text then shifts focus to what it sees as common characteristics and shared viewpoints among specifically Arab atheists.
Right.
What are some of the common threads it identifies in this analysis?
Okay, so the text highlights several recurring themes. The first is this rejection of anything that's unseen, limiting belief and understanding only to what can be empirically observed.
Right.
Second, it points out a tendency to ridicule religious rituals and to portray the people who practice them as, backwards and opposed to progress.
Okay.
Third, it identifies this strain of thought that it calls populism, which it associates with a dislike of Arab identity. sometimes coupled with praising esoteric traditions, and in some cases, like with al-Qasimi, even supporting Zionism.
Okay.
The fourth common denominator is this strong push for total Westernization, similar to Taha Hussein's well-known views on adopting Western culture completely.
Right.
Fifth, the text identifies a rejection of traditional morals and customs in favor of moral relativism.
Right.
Sixth, there's this belief that morals and religions are constantly evolving, so they dismiss past values as outdated.
Right.
Seventh, the text highlights this kind of glorification of matter, nature, and the natural sciences, often combined with creating this artificial divide between religion and applied science, drawing parallels to the historical conflict with the Western Church, and noting how some try to apply this narrative to Islamic societies, using the observations of returning scholars like al-Tatawi as an example.
So that's a pretty detailed breakdown of what the text sees as these unifying characteristics. Are there any other major common denominators it points out?
Yeah, there are a few more key points. The text argues that Arab atheists often discourage resisting foreign occupation. They say people should just accept the situation as it is. It even cites the French campaign in Egypt as an example, saying that some people still celebrate it.
Wow.
It also alleges this close connection between Arab atheism and Zionism and Freemasonry, saying they often praise Zionists and Jewish people.
Okay.
But then, interestingly, the text kind of circles back to its earlier argument and suggests that atheists are actually engaging in a form of polytheism because they elevate nature or other concepts to a divine status.
So it's like they're replacing one form of worship with another.
That's what the text seems to be saying.
Interesting.
And then it attributes to atheists the argument that religion is the main cause of war and conflict.
Right.
But then it counters that by pointing to the secular origins of World War I and II.
Right, right.
And finally, it talks about how Freemasonry supposedly evolved from initially tolerating different religions to eventually embracing atheism as a core principle.
Okay, so the text then broadens its scope again and discusses how atheism spread globally beyond just the Arab world. How does it narrate this expansion?
It lays out this kind of geographical progression, saying that atheism first took hold in Europe, then spread to America, and then to the rest of the world.
Okay.
It really emphasizes the role of the Soviet Union in forcing atheism on people within its territories. This involves suppressing Islamic practices, like changing people's names to remove any religious connections, and even executing people who were found with Quranic verses.
Wow.
But the text does acknowledge that there was resistance to this, and that people continue to practice their religion in secret.
Right.
It also mentions how the Soviet Union set up these atheist schools and organizations, which helped spread atheism further.
Okay.
Interestingly, the text predicted that atheism would decline with the fall of communism, and it points to the revival of Islam in former Soviet territories as evidence of that.
Okay.
Finally, it mentions the Atheist Publishing Association in India, led by a guy named Joseph Enmaruku, and the existence of this International Atheism Award as signs of these organized atheist movements around the world.
So in the second to last section of the text, the focus shifts to how atheism manifests in the modern world and the concerns about its current influence. What are the main worries and observations here?
So the text kind of reiterates its distinction between what it calls true philosophical atheism and this more base, pleasure-seeking atheism of the stomach and private parts that it says is common among people who aren't as intellectually engaged.
Right, so like a shallow, surface-level atheism versus a deeper philosophical one.
Exactly. And it argues that the modern rationalism promoted by atheists, well, it uses false claims of scientific support to deny things like the afterlife and miracles. And this, it says, leads to the erosion of morality and a decline in human behavior.
Okay.
The text expresses this deep concern about the growing number of pro-atheist institutions, publications, and awards, and it warns young Muslims about what it calls this evil doctrine.
Right.
It also notes that atheists are increasingly visible in Egyptian media and that they're demanding constitutional rights. But it suggests that this is just the tip of the iceberg, that there's a much bigger underlying trend.
So it sees it as a more widespread phenomenon than people might realize.
Yeah, definitely. And while the text acknowledges that many Muslims are working to counter atheism through writing and lectures, it criticizes some religious speakers for focusing on divisive and trivial issues, saying that they're actually unintentionally creating a more favorable environment for atheism, especially during times of social unrest, like what's happening in Egypt. Finally, the text expresses this alarm over what it sees as a shift in Egyptian society. It says that there used to be calls for implementing Sharia law, But now there's this open embrace of atheism, and it sees this as part of a broader decline in morality and respect within society.
So the last section of the text draws from physics and the existence of the creator to offer another perspective on atheism, this time from a scientific viewpoint. What are the central arguments presented here?
Okay, so this excerpt contrasts how people used to think about a creator, as this fundamental part of human thought, with the emergence of modern atheism, which it describes as this more recent and kind of anomalous idea that's gained traction over time. It highlights how atheism became like the official religion of communist countries and then spread throughout the world along with Western civilization.
Okay.
One really important point it makes is about the shift in the burden of proof. It says atheism has become the default position, the one that doesn't need any justification, while people who believe in God are now the ones being asked to prove his existence.
Right.
The text also mentions this social stigma in Western societies against people who hold strong religious beliefs, referencing this idea of a culture of disbelief.
Okay.
It argues that religion is increasingly seen as a social phenomenon that needs explaining, while not believing is just considered the natural state of things. It presents atheism as either the stated or the implied basis of a lot of modern scientific philosophy across different fields, leading to this split between scientific interpretations that say the universe is self-sufficient, with no creator, and religious interpretations that involve divine action.
Right.
According to the text, this framework basically pushes religion into the realm of subjective experience or artistic expression, instead of treating it as a source of objective truth.
Okay.
It also discusses how the supposed link between the rise of atheism and all this amazing scientific and technological progress in the West has led other nations to believe that they have to abandon religion if they want to advance as well.
Right. Like it's a prerequisite for progress.
Yeah, exactly. It points out that people who were sent to the West to learn about science often came back with atheistic beliefs, which were easily accepted because religious education was being marginalized. This created this division between religious knowledge, which was limited and often looked down upon, and civil, non-religious knowledge, which was seen as more valuable.
So it's like a hierarchy of knowledge.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Interesting. So finally, how does the text sum up the reasons for atheism's spread?
It points to a few things. Perceived contradictions between religious claims and scientific findings, the clash between the evidence-based approach of science and the dogmatic, unquestioning nature of some religious authorities, and the tendency of certain religious figures to speculate about things beyond what's supported by Scripture.
Okay.
It also mentions disagreements between science and fundamental religious tenets, particularly about the Bible,
Right.
and contradictions within the concept of divinity itself. Things like how God can be the creator but also have a son who was crucified, or the idea of the Trinity. And finally, it talks about the rejection of anthropomorphism, which the text suggests can lead to this very abstract and ultimately unsatisfying concept of God that might actually pave the way for atheism. It notes that Sunni scholars have historically been aware of this danger.
Okay, so let's try to break all of this down one last time for you, the listener. It's clear that this deep dive into the text has given us a very particular perspective on the origins and spread of atheism, right?
Yep, definitely.
It places a lot of emphasis on the role of religious institutions, scientific developments, and big cultural shifts. And it often presents a very strong and distinct interpretation of historical events.
Absolutely. This text provides a very detailed, though not universally accepted narrative that links the actions of the European Church, the rise of certain secular ideologies, and different social and political movements to the growth of atheism in both Western and Islamic contexts.
So, for you listening out there, as you think about all these interconnected factors presented in this text, what are the big questions that come to mind about belief, reason, and the ongoing human search for meaning in a world that's always changing?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It definitely offers a specific perspective on the relationship between faith, science, and the values that shape our societies. And hopefully it's given you some things to ponder and explore further.
Yeah, I hope so.
That's all for our deep dive today, folks.
Thanks for listening.
Catch you next time.